Welcome to Not Entirely Unlike Tea with Christine Collins. Hey there, it's Christine Collins, and a fun one for us today is related to why we enjoy scary movies and TV shows and get a thrill from them, and also why there can sometimes be lingering anxiety or edginess after watching something scary, with a particular fun focus on zombie shows. I thought this topic would be fun in honor of Halloween month. So what exactly is the neuroscience behind why we experience some amount of general anxiety, sometimes for the evening or for a few days after watching something scary? And I will note that this is different for everybody, the level to which you experience it, if at all. And if you are someone who watches a lot of so-called scary content, you may be a little bit desensitized to it and therefore may not have this experience. But if you have noticed that after watching a scary movie or a scary TV series that you kind of notice yourself tiptoeing around a little bit, especially if you're by yourself late at night, and it may feel very irrational to you because a lot of times the themes and topics in horror movies are fantastical and very fictional, such as with zombies or other monsters. And so you may feel even a little bit silly if you are noticing that little bit of edginess. But it turns out that this is actually a pretty normal neuroscientific response to exposure to frightening content. Even when that content is unrealistic and at a logical level we understand that it's not real, the portion of our brain that is responsible for processing emotions and in particular fear, which is the amygdala, is activated and highly active during watching those shows or movies. That activation can continue on for a period of days, maintaining that sense of heightened alertness from experiencing the fear response. It can also trigger the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, which can take a little while to calm down, even after the threat has ended or the imagined threat has ended. And so those hormones elevated in the body for several days even, contributing to ongoing feelings of anxiety. And this can happen regardless of whether the threat that we were exposed to was a real life one or an imagined one or a fictitious one. Our subconscious has a little bit of difficulty sometimes distinguishing between reality and fantasy, which is one reason why tools like visualization are so powerful. But in this context, the visualization, which is up on the screen and spelled out for us, is remaining with us for a period of time following exposure to it. And our brains have a little bit of trouble distinguishing fully between real versus imagined fear and anxiety. The hippocampus, which also is involved in memory formation, works together with the amygdala to create our emotional memories. And that connection between the two can sometimes lead to thoughts, flashbacks, and reflections of that scary content for a period of days following. Watching fictitious scary content, we can still find ourselves having some flashbacks, some memories of things that we saw, especially if they were highly emotionally triggering in the sense of fear. And then when there's repeated exposure where we're actually building neural pathways associated with the fear response, it might make it even easier for our brain to activate those pathways again in the future, so that each time you're coming back to that same movie or TV show that's frightening to you, you're regenerating more of that experience. And even though we know at a logical level that perhaps what we're seeing on the screen can't actually hurt us, our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational, logical thinking, may struggle to fully suppress that emotional response coming in from the amygdala. And that same scary content can have an impact on sleep patterns, increased anxiety, and difficulty overall with the emotional regulation response. So our brains have evolved to respond to potential threats. So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's right in front of us, very real and very logical. Even the concept of something frightening or scary can activate all of these different systems in our brain, because that has helped us for many generations to stay alive. Now, if you find yourself in the situation where you've watched something scary, maybe you pushed your Halloween movie marathon just a little too far, there are some really basic psychological things you can do for yourself that can be very helpful if you wish to get out of the state. One is cognitively reframing, which is just reminding yourself actively that that content really was fictional, just kind of saying it to yourself in your head, just reminding yourself, telling your brain that it's not real, so that that message can kind of spread throughout, and reminding yourself that you actually are physically safe and that what you were feeling frightened about was fictitious. It can also help to kind of counteract that content. I call it cleansing the palate. So if I've watched something a little bit scary or edgy, I like to end my evening with even just a few minutes of something funny or just neutral that's really calm and more relaxing before going to bed or trying to move on to something else. So basically helping to overwrite some of that with more positive or neutral content. And in terms of anxiety in general, things like physical exercise can be very helpful, aerobic activity, that can all help to metabolize stress hormones and release some endorphins, some more positive feeling hormones that can overall improve your mood and reduce your anxiety. There are relaxation techniques also good for anxiety in general, things like deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, yoga, yoga nidra, meditation, hypnosis, all of the different mindset tools that you regularly use to help you calm down or relax from everyday stress. All of those things can be useful in this situation as well. It can also be helpful to laugh about it with friends, or if you've watched it with someone else, talk about the content, verbalizing it. Having that social connection can help to regulate emotions and also offer some different perspectives. Keeping your sleep schedule consistent, doing your same relaxation techniques before bedtime, whatever your sleep protocols are that work for you, making sure that you don't skimp on those, especially on a night where you've watched something scary. So that little bit of extra self-care can go a long way. And I think just making good, mindful decisions, because every single person has a slightly different threshold for what they can manage. Like I mentioned, there are some people who are very desensitized to various forms of horror and scary things because they watch it so frequently. Other people are much more jumpy and much more impacted by watching that type of content. So knowing yourself really well and knowing what your edge really is and what your threshold looks like, so that you can decide for yourself if you get started watching something and it starts to go in a direction that is a little bit more than what you were looking for, being self-aware enough to turn it off before it takes you into territory where you're not going to sleep that night as a result. Now, I thought it would be especially interesting and fun to highlight one type of scary show that a lot of people really are interested in or like a lot, and that is zombie shows and movies. And I was curious to know whether there were some specific factors that caused that fascination and that fear and that whole suspense combination to work so well together in terms of horror. And what I discovered was that there is actually a little bit of research around this, and that some of the things that I've observed just on a personal level are actually known. One is that human-like entities that are almost but not quite human can create very strong feelings of revulsion and unease. So zombies, being kind of an altered form of humanity, can trigger this effect. And of course, there are many other examples that are similar, that have similar undertones of a human-like entity that's not quite human, that we find deeply disturbing for that reason. Another aspect that helps add to the fascination with zombies is a universal fear or threat around contagion and disgust in relation to zombies frequently being affiliated with some kind of contagious substance, whereas they are carriers of this thing that keeps spreading. That can also dial up revulsion, fear, anxiety, and tap into that psychological fear that is sort of universal. Another element that's relevant to zombies in particular is that humans tend to place a very high value on free will an individual agency. Now, I do recognize that this may vary from culture to culture, but in general, there have been some studies in cognitive psychology that have shown that zombies represent a loss of free will and individual agency, which can feel very disturbing for people who have that as a high value, the capacity to make choices, to have free will, to have agency in the sense that you are in control of yourself, where zombies don't appear to have any control over much of anything. And that can create that revulsion and disturbance. And then there's another element often in zombie movies and shows, which is tied to the breakdown of social order, which is sort of a deep-seated human fear. A fear of societal collapse is a very common anxiety for a lot of people. And it can be at a subconscious level too. There's also revulsion and disgust around the concept of reanimated corpses. So there's like a gore disgust element that also gets tied into all of these things. And that may be sort of an ancient survival mechanism as a need to avoid things like that. And humans in general also have a bit of a revulsion to mindless violence where it's senseless. We can't make sense of it. But in particular, the mindless violence triggers some of these responses of disturbance, aligning with that mindless nature in the zombie aggression. And there's also a deep-seated fear around losing one's mind. Zombies certainly represent that, as we talked about the lack of agency. They're not having free will or capable of making decisions and choices. They've lost their minds quite literally while the body continues to exist. So that is sort of an underlying anxiety that many people have. And so when you marry all of these different elements together, everything that we just talked through, and you put it all together into one fantastical creature, it can create a very disturbing overall effect. So it can all be fun and games, but do just be mindful of your own mindset and take good care of your thought patterns, because your mood, your emotions, the way that you're thinking and feeling can have a big impact on the other areas of your life. So I definitely look at it as something to have fun with, but also probably not something to fill your whole life with where you don't watch anything else. And I hope you found this to be really interesting and fun and insightful. And until we connect the next time, I wish you the most magical and creative rest of your day. Thanks for listening. This is Christine Collins at transformcreate.com.